This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be testing Waterman Mysterious Blue. I'll be doing a writing sample on Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll compare this writing sample to a writing sample that I did previously on 20-pound copy paper. Then I'll take a look at some other inks from my collection that are similar to Mysterious Blue, and I'll also take a look at the results of my water resistance test. The first writing sample was done with my glass dip pen, and the ink flowed nice and uniformly off the nib. The swatch was done with a pair of tweezers pinched together and dipped in ink. You can see that there's just a little bit of shading and some light pink sheen. I'm going to begin with my Pilot 78G Extra Fine. This feels pretty good considering how fine this nib is. And this ink being so dark, it's nice and legible. Yeah, I'm going to say this is nice. Next, I'm going to use my Pilot Pereira with a fine stainless steel nib. This feels surprisingly similar to the extra fine. Usually this fine nib feels quite a bit smoother. There's a little bit of feedback, or I would say there's some notable feedback, but I love how this ink looks on the page with this fine nib. I'm going to say nice on this one too. Very usable, but there is some feedback. I better note that here. Next, I've got my FaberCastell Ambition with an extra fine nib. This pen was requested for this ink, and I'm glad it was because I'm having really good results with it. Much smoother than the Pilot Pereira, I'm surprised to say. It's a little bit broader than the Pilot Fine, even though it's an extra fine. I haven't used this pen in a while. This makes me want to dust it off and use it. Slightly wetter than the Pereira Fine. I'm going to say this one is smooth. By extra fine standards, it's smooth. And I like the look of FaberCastell's nibs. Next, I've got my Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. I would say there's not really feedback. Normally, this nib is very smooth. There's not really feedback, there's just friction, which I like. That gives me a little more control. It's not just glassy smooth. I'm going to go ahead and say it is smooth. These two were very similar in the amount of smoothness, and you can see they look very similar in wetness and the line that they put down. Next, I've got my Sailor LeCool with a medium fine stainless steel nib. There's definitely some noticeable feedback. I'm going to say this one's okay, but there's feedback. And I've noticed that with this ink on other writing samples that I've done, you tend to feel the nib on the paper more. Next, I've got my Pilot Perko with a medium nib. Did I say Quebeco Perko? It's Quebeco. And this tends to feel like the typical writing experience. Nothing out of the ordinary here. It's not glassy smooth. There's the typical feedback that I get with most inks. Just enough to give me some control. It feels like a pencil on paper. I like it. It's nice. Next, I've got my Pilot Pluminix with a cursive medium stainless steel nib. This feels okay. It doesn't feel dry. The flatness of this nib spreads out the ink enough that it lightens the ink up. It looks lighter on the page, and I don't get that darkness that I'm wanting out of an ink like this. I'm going to say, well, it felt okay. It feels nice to write with, but you just have to be the judge of whether you like what it's doing to the ink. Next is my Quebeco Lily put with a double broad nib. Darker inks like this don't tend to be something I gravitate to in broader nibs like this. I tend to prefer them in finer nibs. But as I'm looking at this, it seems like the ink is lightening up as it dries. And finally, I've got my Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. Okay, while that dries, let's take a look at the 20-pound copy paper. I feel like it's maintaining its darkness on this paper. Everything felt really nice, except for, I would say, the Pluminix. It's kind of hard to tell here. It's a dark and stormy day outside. You might hear some thunder off and on. This ink, I feel like, fits the mood of this day. It's just a dark ink. But in the Pilot Pluminix, I feel like it flattens the ink out and lightens it up. It's just okay. I really, on this copy paper, the Ambition was just really smooth. And I noticed that on other papers, like I tried it out on Rhodia and whatnot. And, oh, it was just very smooth. In fact, it was even smoother than it was on Tomoe River. On Tomoe River, I tended to feel more feedback even than I did like in the Sailor LeCool. There was even more feedback on the Tomoe River paper, which, I don't know, that's kind of surprising to me. But a lot of these were very smooth. They're very nice. And not much bleeding. I mean, just the wider nibs. Let's see about feathering. Yeah, not much feathering either. Yeah, not bad. And the inks in my collection that were similar to Waterman Mysterious Blue, well, this one's not really similar. I wanted to show it compared to Serenity Blue. Serenity Blue is more of a purpley blue. Sometimes people call it a blurple. But they are similar in the amount of saturation that you see and possibility for shading. Now, Diamine Oxford Blue is quite a bit wetter. Now, I did this ink swatch pretty early on when I first got these swatch cards, so I ended up putting down more ink than really needed to be, but you can see from the little scribble that it is quite a bit wetter. In the lighter parts, you can see that it looks similar to Mysterious Blue. And an ink in my collection that has always been almost indistinguishable from Oxford Blue when I put it in fine nibs is Diatramentus Sherlock Holmes, but look how much different they look. They're both similar in wetness, although the Oxford Blue is a little bit wetter. It came off the nib a little bit quicker, but you can see these two are pretty similar. They have the same type of sheen, just a little bit of red or pinkish type sheen. And I've found that, like I mentioned, when I use these in fine nibs, Oxford Blue and Sherlock Holmes are almost indistinguishable, and I feel like Mysterious Blue is going to perform pretty similarly. It might be slightly more pale than the Oxford Blue and the Sherlock Holmes. Now, Sherlock Holmes is also, the same ink is sold as Night Blue, I believe it is. It's basically the same ink, just different packaging. In the water resistance test, nearly everything was washed away. It is still slightly readable, but not much water resistance. Let me grab the water resistance test for Sherlock Holmes and Oxford Blue. Okay, and here was the water resistance test that I did for Oxford Blue and Sherlock Holmes. Pretty similar. Most of the ink washes away. Sherlock Holmes, the Diatramentus ink, did slightly better than the other two, but wouldn't really call it water resistant. There is some sheen on the pens that laid down heavier amounts of ink, but just a little bit. I don't like it when there's too much sheen, but I would say this is a pleasant ink to use. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.